Greetings, friends and foes. In today's video, we will be looking into warlike and brutish orcs, and my idea of an orc in the Grimdark style. I'll guide you through bruised green skin, and weathered, crusty, rusty and super dusty armor, and I'll talk about my vision, inspiration, and what sets the mood and tone when going into painting. I am Mortis, and thank you for tuning into the Grimdark Compendium. Before coming up with a scheme, I go and draw inspiration from art that truly inspires me. Art that portrays orcs as savage warlords rather than the goofballs many likes to see them as. That is not my image of an orc at all. I go through art of orcs from different universes and worlds, even Warcraft. Yes, even Warcraft. And of course, I'm referring to the old and the first portrayals of orcs before they cartoonified their art. I was always drawn to it, and the same goes for Diablo 2, as they were both a big part of my childhood, and it's kind of what introduced me to dark fantasy settings. So, what I mean by this is, it does not have to be Warhammer to be Warhammer, if that makes any sense. Anything that inspires you to paint a bestial warlord can still be applied to 40k and Age of Sigmar, no matter where it comes from. I urge you to do this to set a tone and mood to whatever creature you're about to paint. And now, first things first, before priming, I stippled on liquid green stuff all over the armor panels, and I did not dilute it at all, as I wanted a very pronounced effect. And as you might know, unfortunately, they stopped producing green stuff. Liquid green stuff, that is. My local Warhammer store had already ran out, so I had to order some Green Stuff World Green Stuff Putty, and it will do the trick. So I primed this in Chaos Black from Relcan, but this can of course be applied by airbrush or brush. And for the first base coat on the skin, I apply Citadel's Blood Reaver Flesh. This was applied in about 1 to 2 thin coats by airbrush. And you might notice the overspray and spattering from my airbrush here. While it's not going to be an issue for this specific paint job, it still looks messy. Unfortunately, some parts in my airbrush got broken when I started filming, and I have of course replaced it since, but excuse the messiness in advance. This paint job, however, does not require much airbrushing at all. This paint job was intended to be an easy task for anyone to execute without spending far too much time on it, while still not sacrificing quality of the paint job. So for the first green paint, I used Citadel's Elysian Green, sprayed in a zenithal angle to still have some of that Blood Reaver flesh in the shadowed areas. And for the last use of airbrush, I came in with an undershading pass using Citadel's Berserker Bloodshade, sprayed from below to get some more depth and more pronounced shadows. I used it sparingly, just barely moving the airbrush trigger, small and controlled bursts. Now, before tackling the rest of the armor and the clothing, you could just continue as is if you're in a hurry, but I do prefer a black base when doing armor and such, so I took a big fat brush and I quickly coated everything but the skin using Citadel's Abaddon Black. And I then dry brushed all armor and weapons using Citadel's Iron Warriors. And make sure that they have a proper amount of paint on their bristles. I usually use a paper towel to wipe out the excess paint, almost like 90-95% of it, and then just go to town with it. I then went back to Abaddon Black and stippled it back to pieces that are generally want to be read as metallic black. I stipple and purposely leave some metallic hints to truly make it read as black steel and not black paint. I wanted to keep the clothes quite simple, to keep it easy to replicate. I used a smaller makeup sponge and stippled on Citadel's Ink by Darkness, and if you should accidentally hit anything else, It's a pretty easy fix. However, do take care for the skin. You can absolutely clean it up, but it's not as easy and straightforward as the metallic or black areas. We'll come back to this at a later stage in the paint job to do some highlighting. For raw leather, such as belts, bags, and straps, I based them out using Citadel's Rhinox hide. And it goes without saying, but obviously you can switch out any paint you like with whatever suits you better. This is just my idea of an easy scheme to pull off for anyone to get some orcs done for Armageddon. And for the first leather highlight, I used Citadel's Mordheim brown. I carelessly stippled it on to edges and raised areas, and I didn't look for any perfection, but only randomness. And don't worry, we're gonna dull it down a lot later on. After all, I am not a colorful man. I'm a man of few colors and dull colors. And for the final leather highlight, I carefully stippled on Citadel's Scrag brown mixed into the Mordheim brown. Back to the orcs pants. I stippled on Citadel's Dark Reaper on edges and raised areas. And once again, I'm not being too careful here. I'm only looking for randomness. And you can obviously go as heavy or as light you want with the highlights. And for this next step, I'll do something I'm absolutely terrible at: freehanding. And you can totally use transfers for this, but I just feel like since it's an orc, it doesn't need perfection. In my imagination, some little Gretchen painted this by hand for his master, so imperfection can add some realism if you have some sort of world building behind it. And I know what you're thinking. Everything looks like a hot mess right now. But I'm gonna need you to trust the process with me here. To add the texture and weathering, I went over the armor with pigment wash I made using natural iron oxide from Vallejo. I mixed this with water and I didn't have any specific mixing plan in my head. I just mixed until I was happy. Normally when I do this, I have a practice blank to test it on before I apply to the beanie. And make sure you mix it very thoroughly. And I mix it again and again before every application. I applied it rather heavily, but I had clean water at hand to dilute the pigment mix on the go. And do watch out for pooling. And since you dilute it with water, you have quite a good amount of time before it dries. So go back and forth and soak up excess with a dry brush to get it to your liking. For the bony bits, skulls and so on, I use Citadel's Ushabti bone, but any off-white will do, just use your favorite. And as for the bullets wrapped around his arm, I simply overbrushed them in Citadel's Runelord brass, just to keep it rather simple. The gun barrel was based in a 50-50 mix of lead belcher and Runelord brass, just to keep some sort of visual difference between the barrel and the bullets. But I still wanted them both to have some sort of copper look to it. Here's where I realized that some of the black parts were a bit too flat, so I went back with some lead belcher and just reinforced the damaged scratching, gently highlighting the edges. It is time to do something that truly strikes fear into the hearts of men: painting eyes. Though I didn't paint any pupils, just a careful application of Mephisto red. I went with the red eyes to try and further sell the effect of an evil look. For the islands, I just based it with Citadel's white scar, and then Citadel's contrast warp lightning. The teeth were just based out in a mix of Ushabti bone and Karak stone. I shaded the teeth and mouth using all of our favorite acrylic wash, Citadel's Caribou Crimson. This is, in my humble opinion, one of the most versatile acrylic washes. I use this for literally anything. Wounds, bruised skin, teeth, gums, shading, you name it. And don't worry too much about any spill on the teeth or on the lip or around the mouth. We're gonna tackle that later on. It's all gonna blend in anyways. I also use this around the face implants or any scars and wounds, just to reinforce irritated skin. Before I continue, I quickly went over the teeth again with the same Carrickstone Ushabti bone mix. And I painted the lower lips only using Citadel's Bugman's Glow, and I highlighted them by painting little lines using Bugman's Glow again, but with a little of white into the mix. And just like we made the pigment wash before, we replicate the mix, but this time with Amomig Russian Earth dry pigments. I went over all leather areas and try not to let it pool. However, it's not a big deal if it does. I immediately hit it with a blow dryer after application, and you will notice patches that look super dry and crusty. Just go over them with water and remove the excess pigments. My idea for an all matte dusty clothing is the planet Armageddon. War wages between orcs and blood angels. And as you may know, Armageddon is a war-torn planet, dry, dusty, and filled with dead earth and ruins. So it's only fitting that the clothing matches the environment. And this goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning of the video. World building and making up ideas behind the warband before you start painting. For example, make sure that the clothing and the armor match the basing that you do for your characters. And to introduce an accent to the miniature, I painted one shoulder pollen red, and I simply stippled on Citadel's corn red, allowing lead badge to shine through. I then stippled on Rhinox hide, before stippling another layer of Mephiston red. And finally, I touched it up a little with some lead belcher. And now it's time to clean up the leather, using only water. Go back and forth, move it around to your liking, just avoid excessive pooling. For other details, such as the leather strap on his axe and the holster for his gun, I based them out in Citadel's Steel Legion Rab, and I then dry brushed them by just introducing some Ushabti bone into the mix. And to add even more details, I painted on some hazard stripes on cables using Uriel yellow. And same thing here as with the shoulders. Just apply it and you're halfway there. It doesn't have to look good in the beginning. Just go back and forth between the yellow and the black until you have a decent result. I went in with a second application of Caribou Crimson in between the teeth and lip, to further reinforce the effect of affected gums and blood. And finally, we can address the skin again. I highlighted all raised areas with Citadel Ogryn Camo, lightly diluted with water. I only left the previous layer in the most deepest recesses. However, when I highlighted the face, I used a less diluted mix to ensure nothing flows into the crevices of the face. I kind of sketched out the places where the highlights would be before really blending them in. And don't worry if they look kind of rough in the end. We're gonna blend them in even more with oils later on. And now, this is where the fun begins. For the unifying wash on everything but the skin, I heavily applied Goon's Grime mixed 1-to-1 with spirits. Normally, I would use a flat palette and I would mix enamels on the go, depending on what I'm painting of course. But for the sake of keeping this as simple and beginner friendly as possible, I thought a steady mix would work well. And remember to always keep an eye out for pooling. However, it's not the end of the world if you do. That's the beauty of the Villainy Ink's enamels. They are extremely versatile and has a long working time before they fully cure. So you can go back and forth, move the enamels around, remove, apply, and so on. I washed the skin with equal parts Villainy Ink's Vile Tinge Green, Coelia Green, and Caput Mortuum, and equal parts White Spirits. You can either wait up to 30 minutes to dry or come in with a hairdryer on medium heat for about 30 seconds. And then it's time for a reductive technique. And if you aren't familiar with what it is, I really recommend you watching the super in-depth guide to reductive technique on the Grimdark Compendium's channel. But it is, in its essence, removal of enamels and blending them in. You can use Q-tips or brushes for this. I tend to use brushes for hard to reach areas only, or if I want to manipulate the enamels to make streaks of rust or dirt. But this time around, we're only using Q-tips. One side damp with spirits, and the other side dry. To blend the enamels, I use what I call a back and forth technique, because it's literally what I do. I switch back and forth all the time to keep removing excess and blending. When the removal is done, I came back with what is probably the best enamel next to Goon's Grime and the Decrepit Filth, Carrion Crimson. Now, Carrion Crimson is a deep reddish purple pinkish enamel that is unmatched when it comes to irritated skin, blood or even gore. So for every 5 drops I only had a brush full of spirits, and I applied it into the mouth, elbows, scars, wounds, or random areas where I wanted more interest in the skin. To add some rust filters, I used Sector Rust, mixed 1-to-1 with spirits, and I didn't really put any thinking into it, I just randomly applied it to areas that just felt right. And once again, before removing Carrion Crimson and Sector Rust, I came in with a hairdryer to make it dry quicker. And eventually I had to stop myself. You see, I always go back and forth when painting with enamels, removing, applying, rearranging, removing, and so on. And I did this with Sector Rust and even the Carrion Crimson on random places to further push variation on the skin. And to further push the shadows and more hues, I went in with a 1-to-1 Decrepit Filth and Spirits mix, in selective areas only. And the same kind of reductive technique as before was replicated. Now, you might see that the skin is more reddish and bruised here than before. And this is what I meant when I was talking about that I always go back and forth. This is one of those moments. Essentially what I did here, I just applied Carrion Crimson in the crevices of the muscles, and I didn't even use a reductive technique. I just left this as is, because we're gonna blend it in now with oils. For the final touch on the skin, I highlighted the raised areas using Abteilung Buff. Now, Buff is an oil-based paint that is just excellent for any skin really. I take even less than a bead on a dry clean brush and then wipe off about 95% of it on a paper towel. I then begin to sketch the muscles of the orc. And when the sketching is done, I come in with another dry and clean brush to blend the oils. It will make it somewhat translucent and blend into the enamels applied before, making a super smooth highlight. And when it comes to the actual blending, this is where I can spend an absurd amount of time, but I tried to keep it relatively short here. Now, something extremely important that you will hear a lot about in the Grimdark style of painting is surface finish variation. And what I mean by that is how a surface appears to be, if something is matte, if it's gloss or satin. And now, I talked about how I wanted all armor clothes to be very dry and matte. So I applied the AK Ultra Matte Varnish on all areas except for the skin. And that, of course, since the skin is automatically going to be satin. The only thing I did is apply some AK Gloss Varnish to the lip and sort of a droll running down his cheek to sell the feeling of a frothing berserker. And for the final effects on the metals, I use some Dirty Down's Rust. Now, Dirty Down Rust is probably my favorite Rust product. It's insanely realistic and dries super matte within seconds. And Dirty Down Rust is water soluble, so it can be diluted with water to get a different finish. The more you dilute it, the brighter it gets. And worth noting, if you varnish your miniatures, make sure to do it before applying the Dirty Down Rust, as the varnish will otherwise reactivate your rust. And to really make the metals pop, I did a final dry brush on the edges using lead belcher. And in some areas where the Dirty Down Rust have left way too hard edges, I just stippled on some lead belcher to smooth it out. And so finally, the gloss varnish to replicate some saliva, because, you know, after all, he's a brutish, rotting berserker. And then I stipple on some blood for the blood gun on the weapons, because, you know, an orc has to have a bloodied weapon. And so, my rambling has come to an end. I'd like to thank you for taking time to watch this video, and I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Grimdark Compendium for allowing me to share my thoughts and insights on their channel. If you found this tutorial useful, make sure to visit the Grimdark Compendium's website. On there you can find tons and tons and tons of in-depth videos and guides on just about everything in the Grimdark style. Once again, I am Mortis, and thank you for tuning in. Until next time, my friends.